At that glittering party, they called me useless and threw me out the door in front of hundreds of people. They didn't know that just hours later, I would sell my $27 million stake, and every one of their desperate calls would meet only silence. That night, they thought I'd cry in the darkness, but they had no idea I'd already found my weapon. My name is Clara Weston, and I should have known better than to show up wearing my mother's diamond necklace to my own family's company anniversary party. The ballroom at the Adolphus Hotel gleamed like something out of a magazine spread, crystal chandeliers casting prisms of light across marble floors, waiters gliding between clusters of Dallas elite with champagne flutes that caught the amber glow. Everyone who mattered in Texas real estate was there, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceilings like a symphony of success I'd helped orchestrate but was never invited to conduct. I stood near the entrance, smoothing the fabric of my simple black dress, elegant but understated, the kind of outfit that whispered rather than shouted. My fingers found the small diamond pendant at my throat, the one piece of my mother I still carried. She'd worn it to every important occasion, and touching it now felt like borrowing courage from a ghost. "Is that Clara Weston?" The voice drifted from a cluster of women in designer gowns, their words sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise. "I heard she's still living in that tiny apartment downtown." 38 and single, another voice chimed in, dripping with manufactured sympathy. "Such a shame. Her brother built this empire while well, what does she even do?" The words hit like ice water, but I kept my expression neutral. I'd perfected this mask over years of family gatherings where I was treated like an expensive piece of furniture necessary for the room to look complete, but never actually functional. Across the room, I spotted Trent holding court near the company logo backdrop, his arm wrapped around Madeline Ross like she was a trophy he'd just won. My brother looked every inch the successful CEO in his tailored tuxedo, his silver hair gleaming under the lights. At 42, he commanded attention effortlessly, the kind of presence that made investors open their checkbooks and competitors step aside. Madeline was a different kind of weapon entirely. 29, blonde, and sharp as a blade hidden in silk. She'd attached herself to Trent 6 months ago, and since then, every family interaction had become a carefully orchestrated performance designed to remind me of my place in the hierarchy. I watched her scan the room, her gaze landing on me with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. She whispered something in Trent's ear, and he glanced my way with the kind of look you'd give a stain on an expensive carpet. The ambient temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as Madeline detached herself from Trent and began moving through the crowd toward me. Conversations parted around her like water, guests stepping aside to watch what promised to be entertainment. "Clara," she said when she reached me, her voice honey-sweet with an undertone of steel. "I'm surprised to see you here." "It's my family's company," I replied quietly, my hand instinctively moving to my mother's necklace again. "Is it, though?" Madeline's smile could have powered the chandeliers. "I mean, what exactly is your contribution? Trent works 18-hour days building this empire while you—" She made a vague gesture, as if my existence was too insignificant to categorize. The conversations around us had stopped entirely now. I could feel dozens of eyes watching, waiting to see how the useless sister would respond to being put in her place. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The only misunderstanding," Madeline continued, her voice rising just enough to ensure the growing audience could hear every word, "is why someone who contributes nothing thinks they belong at a celebration of actual achievement." She turned to the crowd, playing to them like an actress who'd found her spotlight. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have a party crasher." The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, I felt every eye in the room focused on me, every whispered conversation about my failures made manifest. My cheeks burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the champagne I hadn't touched. Trent appeared at Madeline's side, not to defend me, but to survey the situation with the detached interest of someone watching a minor traffic accident. "Security!" Madeline called out, her voice carrying across the ballroom like a bell. "We have someone here who doesn't belong." Two men in dark suits materialized from the edges of the room, moving toward me with the efficient purpose of people accustomed to removing problems quietly. The crowd stepped back, creating a circle around me like I was something toxic they were afraid to touch. "Ma'am," one of the guards said, his voice professionally neutral, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." I looked at Trent one last time, searching his face for any flicker of the brother who used to build blanket forts with me, who cried when our mother died, who once told me I was the strongest person he knew. But that person was gone, replaced by someone who could watch his sister be humiliated without lifting a finger. The walk to the exit felt like a death march. My heels clicked against the marble with a rhythm that seemed to echo the word useless with every step. I kept my chin up, my shoulders straight, even as I felt pieces of myself crumbling with each passing second. The last thing I heard before the ballroom doors closed behind me was Madeline's laughter, bright and victorious, followed by the resumption of conversations as if I'd never existed at all. Standing alone in the hotel corridor, surrounded by the muffled sounds of my own family's celebration, I finally understood something with crystal clarity. They thought they'd won. They thought the humiliation would break me, send me scurrying back to my small life to nurse my wounds in silence. They had no idea they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The drive home through Dallas streets blurred past in a haze of neon and silence. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white, but I couldn't seem to loosen them. Every red light became a moment where Madeline's voice echoed in my head. "What exactly is your contribution?" And every green light pulled me deeper into a numbness I'd never felt before. The radio played some mindless pop song, but I couldn't hear the melody over the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I reached over and switched it off, letting the silence fill the car like water flooding a sinking ship. Better to drown in quiet than in the noise of a world that had just watched me get erased. My apartment building looked smaller than usual when I pulled into the parking garage, smaller and shabbier, like everything else in my life when held up against the golden backdrop of Trent's empire. I sat in my car for a full 5 minutes after turning off the engine, staring at the concrete wall in front of me and wondering when I'd become the kind of person who got thrown out of her own family's celebration. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt endless. My reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman I barely recognized hollow-eyed, defeated, still wearing that ridiculous necklace-like armor that had failed to protect anything at all. When the doors opened, I walked down the hallway on legs that felt disconnected from my body, each step echoing off the walls like a countdown to something I couldn't name. My apartment welcomed me with the familiar scent of vanilla candles and the soft hum of the air conditioning. It was a sanctuary I'd created over the years, cream-colored walls lined with photographs, a small kitchen that actually got used, furniture that had been chosen for comfort rather than impression. Everything here was mine, really mine, in a way that nothing else in my life seemed to be anymore. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, finally allowing myself to breathe. The silence here was different from the silence in the car, gentler, less accusatory. This was the silence of safety, of a place where nobody could call security to have me removed. My eyes found the wall of photographs I'd carefully curated over the years. There was Mom at my college graduation, her smile radiant with pride, Trent and me as kids, building sandcastles during that summer in Galveston when we still believed the world belonged to both of us equally, Dad teaching us both to drive in the empty parking lot behind his first office building, back when Weston Properties was just a dream with a business loan attached. When had it all changed? When had I become the sister who contributed nothing while Trent became the golden boy who could do no wrong? I reached up and unclasped my mother's necklace, feeling the weight of it in my palm. Such a small thing to carry so much hope. Mom had worn this to every board meeting, every investor dinner, every moment when she needed to remind herself that she belonged in rooms full of powerful men. She'd built half of what Weston Properties became, but history had a way of forgetting the women who stood behind the men with the louder voices. Setting the necklace down on my coffee table felt like setting down the last piece of who I used to be. The woman who wore her mother's jewelry for courage. The woman who showed up to family events hoping this time would be different. The woman who let herself be diminished until she was small enough to be discarded. I walked to my kitchen and poured myself a glass of wine I didn't want, then stood at my window looking out at the Dallas skyline. Somewhere out there, the party was still going on. Trent was probably giving his speech about vision and legacy and the future of Texas real estate. Madeline was probably holding court with her admirers, telling the story of how she'd identified and removed an unwanted element from their exclusive gathering. They thought I was nothing, a burden, a useless appendage to a family tree that would be better off pruned. But as I stood there, something began to shift inside me. Not anger. Exactly, that would come later. This was something colder, more methodical, a recognition that flooded through me like ice water in my veins. I walked to my desk and opened my laptop, the familiar blue glow illuminating my face in the darkened apartment. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, then began to move with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. First, I logged into my banking app and transferred funds from our joint family accounts into my personal checking account. Money I'd contributed over the years, money that had my name on it, money they'd probably forgotten I could access. Next, I called my credit card company and removed Trent as an authorized user on the card he'd been using for his business expenses. The representative was efficient and professional, asking no questions about why I was making these changes at 11:30 at night. Each action felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Each click, each transfer, each severed financial tie was a small declaration of independence from people who'd treated my generosity like a given and my presence like a problem. My phone buzzed with a text from Trent. "Where did you go? People are asking." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Let him wonder. Let him explain to his guests why his sister had vanished. Let him try to smooth over the ugly scene his girlfriend had created without having to acknowledge what had actually happened. The photographs on my wall seemed to be watching me as I worked, and I found myself looking back at them with new eyes. In every single one, I was smiling, supporting, standing slightly behind, slightly to the side, making space for other people to shine. When had I decided that was my role? When had I agreed to be the supporting character in my own life story? I closed the laptop and sat back in my chair, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Power. Not the borrowed power of family name or inherited influence, but the clean, sharp power of choice. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was the one making decisions about my own life. The necklace caught the light from my laptop screen, sending tiny rainbows across the coffee table. Tomorrow, I would find out exactly how much power I really had. Tomorrow, I would discover what $27 million in company stock could accomplish when wielded by someone who'd finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. Tonight, though, I would sit in my small apartment and let the silence teach me who I was when nobody else was watching. I would let the darkness show me what I looked like when I stopped trying to please people who would never be satisfied. I was done being useless. I was done being invisible. And I was definitely done being the kind of person who could be thrown out of her own family's party without consequences. They thought tonight was the end of something. They had no idea it was actually the beginning. I waited until 7:15 in the morning to make the call that would change everything. Robert Matthews had been handling my financial portfolio for 12 years, ever since Mom died and left me her shares in Weston Properties. He was the kind of advisor who answered his phone at any hour, who remembered the names of his clients' pets, and who'd never once questioned my decision to remain a silent partner while Trent ran the company into what everyone assumed was success. Clara. His voice carried the slight rasp of someone who'd been awake for hours already, probably reviewing market reports with his morning coffee. "This is early, even for you. Everything all right?" I stood at my kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the Dallas skyline in shades of gold and amber. The city looked different this morning, sharper, more defined, like someone had adjusted the focus on a camera lens. "Robert, I need you to sell my entire stake in Weston Properties. Today." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the clock ticking on my kitchen wall. When Robert finally spoke, his voice had shifted into the careful tone he used when clients made decisions that might be driven by emotion rather than logic. "Oh, Clara, that's a $27 million position. Are you sure you want to make this kind of move without sleeping on it? Maybe we should schedule a meeting, go over your options." I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I surprised myself with how steady my voice sounded, how certain. I want it sold immediately, all of it, every single share. "But Clara, the tax implications alone—" "I don't care about the taxes." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't soften them. "I don't care about the market timing or the quarterly projections or any of the reasons you're about to give me for why this is a bad idea. I want out. Robert, completely out." I could hear him typing, probably pulling up my portfolio on his computer, calculating the exact magnitude of what I was asking him to do. Robert had watched me build this position over the years, adding to it whenever I could, treating it like a retirement fund and a family legacy rolled into one. To him, this probably looked like financial suicide. "The stock is performing well," he said carefully. "Your brother's been expanding into Austin and Houston markets. The commercial division just landed 3 major contracts, and none of that matters to me anymore." I walked away from the window, pacing through my small living room like a caged animal who'd finally figured out the door was unlocked. "I want to liquidate everything today. Can you do it, or do I need to find someone who can—" The threat hung in the air between us. Robert had built his reputation on taking care of his clients, even when they made decisions he didn't understand, especially then. "I can do it," he said finally. "But Clara, I have to ask what happened last month. You were talking about increasing your position, maybe taking a more active role in company decisions. Now you want to sell everything." I thought about telling him the truth, about Madeline's public humiliation, about Trent's silence, about standing in that hotel corridor feeling like a ghost at my own family's funeral. But some stories were too raw to share, even with someone who'd been managing my money for over a decade. Let's just say I've had a change of perspective on family loyalty. Robert sighed, the sound of a man who'd seen enough wealthy families implode to recognize the warning signs. "I'll need about 2 hours to structure this properly. The volume is going to attract attention. A $27 million sell-off of a closely held company doesn't happen quietly. Your brother's going to know about this before the market closes." Good. The word came out with more venom than I'd intended, but I didn't take it back. Let Trent scramble. Let him try to explain to his board of directors why his sister was dumping her entire position. Let him wonder what other shoes might be about to drop. "Clara, just do it, Robert, and call me when it's done." I hung up before he could offer any more well-meaning advice about family businesses and emotional decision-making. My hand was shaking as I set the phone down on the counter, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the sheer adrenaline of finally taking action instead of just enduring. $27 million. The number felt abstract until I said it out loud to my empty apartment. $27 million. It was more money than most people would see in a lifetime, and I was about to use it as a weapon. My phone started ringing at 9:45. Trent's name appeared on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again, and again. By 10:15, I had 6 missed calls and 3 increasingly frantic text messages. "What the hell are you doing? Call me back now. Clara, you're making a huge mistake." I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at my kitchen table, watching my phone light up with each new attempt at contact. There was something deeply satisfying about the silence I was creating, the way my refusal to engage was obviously driving him crazy. At 10:30, my mother's sister called. "Clara, honey, Trent just called me. He says you're selling your shares, sweetie, Your mother wanted you to have those. She wanted you to always be part of what she built." Aunt Linda meant well, but she'd never understood the dynamics in our family. She still believed in the fiction that Trent and I were equal partners, that my silence all these years had been choice rather than conditioning. Mom also wanted me to be treated with respect. I said quietly, "I don't think she would have approved of last night." Last night? What happened last night? Of course, Trent hadn't told her about the party, about Madeline, about security escorting me out like I was a troublemaker instead of a founding family member. "Ask Trent," I said, and hung up. At 11:15, Robert called back. "It's done," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd just executed a financial nuclear option. "All 27 million, liquidated and transferred to your personal accounts. Clara." The phone has been ringing nonstop since word got out. "Your brother, his lawyer, 3 different board members." "How many times has my phone rung since you started the sale?" I could hear him typing, probably checking his call log. 56 times. 56 calls from numbers associated with Weston Properties in the last hour and a half. 56 calls. 56 desperate attempts to reach me, to control me, to convince me to undo what couldn't be undone. For years, they'd barely acknowledged my existence. Now, suddenly, I was the most important person in their world. "Don't answer any of them," I told Robert. "Forward everything to my personal voicemail, and don't discuss my financial situation with anyone. Client confidentiality extends to family members, doesn't it?" "Absolutely. Clara, are you going to be all right? This kind of move, it's going to have consequences." "I'm counting on it." I hung up and turned my phone to silent, watching as the screen continued to light up with incoming calls. Each flash of light felt like a small victory, proof that I wasn't as powerless as they'd assumed. $27 million in liquid assets, 56 phone calls in 90 minutes, and a family that was finally paying attention to me. I poured myself another cup of coffee and settled in to enjoy the silence. Let them call. Let them panic. Let them wonder what else I might be planning. For the first time in years, I held all the cards, and I was just getting started. By 2:30 that afternoon, I was sitting in the downtown Houston office of Harper Lane, the kind of lawyer who made powerful men nervous and their wives call her for referrals. Harper's office occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower that scraped the Texas sky, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city sprawling toward the Gulf. Everything in the room was designed to project competence and controlled aggression: the sleek black desk, the wall of legal degrees and professional accolades, the leather chairs positioned to make visitors feel simultaneously welcomed and slightly intimidated. Harper herself was a study in sharp angles and surgical precision. 45 years old, silver-streaked auburn hair pulled back in a style that suggested she had better things to do than worry about fashion, and gray eyes that seemed to see straight through whatever facade you were trying to maintain. She'd built her reputation defending women in high-stakes divorces and corporate disputes, the kind of cases where millions of dollars in family empires hung in the balance. 27 million in a single morning, she said, reviewing the documents I'd brought. "That's not just making a statement, Clara. That's declaring war." I shifted in my chair, suddenly aware of how small my problems might seem to someone who regularly handled cases involving oil fortunes and political dynasties. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I should have tried talking to Trent first, worked things out privately. "Stop!" Harper's voice cut through my uncertainty like a scalpel. "The first thing we need to establish is that you don't apologize for protecting yourself. Ever. Tell me exactly what happened at that party." So I told her everything: Madeline's public humiliation, Trent's silence, the security guards, the walk of shame through a room full of Dallas elite who'd watched me get erased from my own family's story. Harper listened without interrupting, taking notes in precise handwriting that probably cost opposing counsel millions in legal fees. "Oh, how long have you been financially supporting your brother?" she asked when I finished. Supporting him, I haven't. Bank records don't lie. Clara, I pulled what I could access legally this morning. She slid a folder across the desk toward me. Bail money when he got arrested for that DUI in college. The loan guarantee when he couldn't qualify for the Austin expansion financing. The personal funds you've transferred to cover company shortfalls at least 6 times in the past 4 years. I stared at the numbers on the page, seeing my own financial history laid out in black and white. Somehow, when the transfers were spread out over time, when they were framed as family obligations or temporary assistance, I'd never added them up. The total was staggering. You've been subsidizing Trent's empire to the tune of nearly $4 million over the past decade. Harper continued. Money that came from your inheritance, your salary from the consulting work you do, your mother's life insurance settlement. You've been funding his success while he's been treating you like a charity case. The words hit like physical blows. I'd known I was generous with family, but seeing it quantified this way made me feel like the most gullible person alive. There's more, Harper said, opening another file. I made some calls this morning, reached out to contacts in commercial real estate. Your brother's expansion into Houston. The financing came through a company called Meridian Consulting. Want to guess who owns Meridian Consulting? I felt my stomach drop. Madeline Ross, registered business owner as of 8 months ago. The same Madeline Ross who humiliated you last night is now a paid consultant to your family's company, receiving fees that would make most CEOs jealous. Harper spread out bank statements and corporate filings like she was laying down cards in a poker game. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for: money flowing from Weston Properties to Meridian Consulting in amounts that corresponded exactly with Trent and Madeline's European vacation, their new Range Rover, the down payment on the penthouse apartment they'd been photographed in for last month's Dallas Lifestyle magazine. He's been funneling company money to his girlfriend through fake consulting contracts, I said, the reality of it settling over me like ice water. He's been stealing from his own company. Our own company, Harper corrected. Until this morning, you owned 38% of Weston Properties. As a major shareholder, you had a fiduciary duty to protect the company's interests. More importantly, you had the right to demand accountability for how corporate funds were being used. I thought about all the times Trent had mentioned cash flow problems. All the times he'd asked me to delay taking dividends so he could reinvest in growth opportunities. While I'd been tightening my own budget and deferring my own needs, he'd been paying for his girlfriend's lifestyle with company money. What can we do about it? I asked. Harper's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. We can do quite a lot, actually. Corporate malfeasance, breach of fiduciary duty, potential fraud charges if we can prove intent to deceive other shareholders. But first, we need to understand what you want out of this. Revenge is satisfying, but it's not a legal strategy. I thought about that question as I stared out at the Houston skyline. What did I want? Justice felt too abstract. Apologies felt too little, too late. What I wanted was for them to understand that actions had consequences, that you couldn't build your success on someone else's generosity and then discard them when it became convenient. I want them to face the choice between doing the right thing and losing everything, I said finally. I want Trent to have to choose between protecting Madeline and protecting the company Dad built. And if he chooses Madeline, then he loses both? Harper leaned back in her chair, studying me with the appraising look of someone who'd just realized her client might be more interesting than she'd initially thought. There's something else you should know, she said, pulling out one more file. The board of directors has been asking questions about Trent's management for months. Apparently, some of the older members remember your mother's contributions to the company and aren't thrilled about the direction things have been heading. Your stock sale this morning sent shockwaves through more than just your family. She slid a letter across the desk official letterhead from Morrison, Price and Associates, the law firm that represented Weston Properties' board of directors. They want to meet with you. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Officially, it's to discuss the impact of your stock sale on company stability. Unofficially, I think they're looking for an excuse to force some changes in leadership. I picked up the letter, feeling the weight of expensive paper between my fingers. Tomorrow morning. I would walk into a boardroom as something I'd never been before, a person with power who wasn't afraid to use it. "Will you represent me?" I asked Harper. "Clara, I specialize in cases where women reclaim power from men who've underestimated them. This isn't just a case for me, it's a calling." As I left Harper's office that afternoon, my phone showed 83 missed calls and 47 unread text messages. The desperation in those numbers felt like vindication, proof that my silence was more powerful than any words I could have spoken. Tomorrow, the silence would end. Tomorrow, I would finally have my say. But tonight, I would let them wonder what I was planning. Tonight, I would let them remember what it felt like to be powerless. The boardroom at Weston Properties had always intimidated me, with its imposing mahogany table that could seat 20 people and windows that overlooked the Dallas skyline like a corporate throne room. This morning, at exactly 10 o'clock, I walked through those heavy oak doors not as Trent's little sister, but as a woman with Harper Lane at my side and a briefcase full of evidence that could destroy everything my brother had built. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the polished wood surface, making everything look stark and unforgiving. The air conditioning hummed with mechanical efficiency, but the atmosphere in the room was anything but cool. I could feel the tension crackling like electricity before a thunderstorm. 5 board members sat along one side of the table, men in their 60s and 70s who'd worked with my father decades ago, who remembered when my mother's signature had been required on every major decision. Their faces were carefully neutral, but I caught the way their eyes followed my movements, calculating and assessing. Trent sat at the head of the table where Dad used to hold court, his usually perfect posture slightly stiff, his jaw clenched in a way that suggested he'd been grinding his teeth all night. He looked older than he had 2 days ago, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at the anniversary party. "Clara," he said when he saw me, his voice carrying forced warmth that fooled no one. "Thank you for coming. I'm sure we can clear up this misunderstanding quickly." "There's no misunderstanding," I replied, taking the seat directly across from him. Harper settled beside me with the quiet confidence of someone who'd destroyed bigger egos than my brother's in rooms just like this one. Board Chairman William Morrison, who'd been Dad's oldest friend, cleared his throat. "Clara, your stock sale yesterday created considerable concern about company stability. As you know, any transaction of that magnitude requires board notification under our corporate charter." Which is why we're here," Harper interjected smoothly. "Ms. Weston exercised her legal right to divest her holdings. If the board has concerns about company stability, perhaps we should examine why a founding family member felt compelled to take such dramatic action." Trent leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Clara, I don't know what's gotten into you, but selling your entire position was reckless. You've hurt not just yourself, but everyone in this room, everyone who depends on this company." "Stop!" The word came out sharper than I'd intended, cutting through his practiced speech like a knife. "Don't you dare lecture me about hurting people who depend on this company." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the air conditioning cycling, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the barely audible tick of the antique clock Dad had hung on the wall 30 years ago. "Shh, gentlemen," Harper said, opening her briefcase with practiced efficiency. "I think it's time we discussed why Ms. Weston felt compelled to protect her interests. Are you familiar with Meridian Consulting?" I watched Trent's face go white. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his posture, but I'd known him my entire life. I could read his tells like a book. That's a legitimate consulting firm," he said carefully. "They've provided valuable strategic guidance for our Houston expansion." Harper spread documents across the table with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments. Bank statements, wire transfer records, corporate filings, all arranged to tell a story that became more damning with each piece of evidence. "Meridian Consulting is owned by Madeline Ross," Harper said conversationally. "Ms. Ross has received over $600,000 in consulting fees from Weston Properties in the past 8 months. Interesting timing, considering her relationship with your CEO began around the same time. Board member James Phillips picked up one of the bank statements, his reading glasses sliding down his nose as he studied the numbers. These payments, they're not reflected in our quarterly consulting budget reports. Because they were categorized as operational expenses, Harper continued, buried in various line items to avoid scrutiny, travel costs, office supplies, technology infrastructure, all creative accounting for what appears to be a systematic diversion of corporate funds. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I watched as each board member processed the implications, their faces shifting from confusion to concern to barely contained anger. "This is ridiculous," Trent said, but his voice had lost its authoritative edge. "Madeline provides legitimate strategic consulting. Her recommendations have been invaluable." "For European vacations," I asked quietly. "For luxury car purchases. For a penthouse apartment that was featured in Dallas Lifestyle magazine." I slid a photograph across the table, a glossy spread showing Trent and Madeline in their new home. The same home purchased 3 days after a large consulting payment to Meridian. Morrison removed his glasses and set them on the table with deliberate precision. "Trent, these are serious allegations. If corporate funds have been misappropriated—" "They haven't been misappropriated," Trent snapped, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. "Every payment to Meridian was approved through proper channels." "Approved by whom?" Harper asked. "According to your corporate charter, any consulting contract over $50,000 requires board approval. I don't see any board minutes reflecting votes on Meridian Consulting." The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. I could see Trent calculating, trying to find an explanation that wouldn't implicate him further. But there wasn't one. Harper had done her homework too well. "Furthermore," Harper continued, pulling out another set of documents, "Ms. Weston has documentation showing she's personally covered company shortfalls totaling nearly $4 million over the past decade. Money that was never repaid, never acknowledged, never formally structured as loans or investments." She placed copies of bank transfers in front of each board member, a paper trail of my own financial generosity that suddenly looked less like family support and more like corporate subsidy. "So we have a pattern," Harper summarized. "Corporate funds being diverted to the CEO's personal relationships, while a major shareholder subsidizes company operations out of her own pocket. Meanwhile, that same shareholder is publicly humiliated and excluded from company functions." Morrison's jaw was working like he was chewing something unpleasant. "Trent, is there anything you'd like to say in response to these allegations?" I watched my brother look around the table, searching for allies who were no longer there. These men had known our father, had respected our mother, had watched me grow up in the shadows of this company. They'd also spent decades building their own reputations, and I could see them calculating how much damage association with Trent's choices might cause. "This is a witch hunt," Trent said finally. "Clara's upset about a social misunderstanding." A social misunderstanding. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. "You let your girlfriend have me thrown out of our family's anniversary party. Security guards. Trent. In front of everyone we do business with." The words hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. I saw Morrison wince, saw Phillips shake his head in disapproval. These were men from a generation that believed in family loyalty, in treating women with respect, in conducting business with dignity. "Clara, I'm sorry about that," Trent said, but his apology sounded hollow, desperate. Madeline was out of line. I should have stopped it. "Yes," I said quietly. "You should have." Harper reached into her briefcase one more time, pulling out a folder thick with legal documents. "Gentlemen, we have a proposal. Mr. Weston can resign as CEO and make full restitution for the misappropriated funds. Or we can file formal complaints with the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding potential securities fraud and breach of fiduciary duty." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every decision that had led to this moment pressing down on the room like a physical force. Morrison looked at Trent, then at me, then at the evidence spread across the table like accusations written in black and white. "Trent," he said finally, his voice heavy with disappointment, "I think you need to consider what's best for the company your father built." I watched something break in my brother's eyes, saw the moment he realized that his charm and confidence couldn't talk him out of this corner. For the first time in our lives, I held all the power, and there was nothing he could do to take it away. The game had changed, and finally, I was winning. The next 20 minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed execution. Harper placed a resignation letter in front of Trent, the crisp white paper stark against the dark mahogany table. "This document outlines the terms," she said with clinical precision. "Immediate resignation as CEO, full restitution of the $600,000 paid to Meridian Consulting, and a public statement acknowledging financial irregularities that will be corrected under new leadership." Trent stared at the paper like it was a death warrant. "You can't be serious. This company would collapse without me. I've tripled revenue in 5 years, expanded into 3 new markets. Using funds that weren't yours to spend." Morrison interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years in corporate boardrooms. "Trent, your father built this company on integrity. Your mother died believing it would always represent the values she instilled in both of you." I watched my brother's face cycle through emotions, anger, disbelief, desperation, and finally, something that looked almost like grief. "Clara, please, we're family. We can work this out privately. You don't have to destroy everything we've built." "I'm not destroying anything," I said quietly. "I'm saving it." The words felt strange in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd never learned but somehow understood perfectly. For 38 years, I'd been the one making peace, smoothing over conflicts, sacrificing my own interests for family harmony. Now I was the one drawing lines in the sand. Board member Robert Hayes, who'd been silent through most of the meeting, finally spoke up. "What about the Houston expansion? The Austin contract's Trent's right about the growth he's generated." Harper was ready for this question. She pulled out another folder, this one containing financial projections and market analyses. "The growth was funded by Ms. Weston's personal subsidies and Ms. Ross's consulting payments. Strip away those artificial supports, and the expansion barely breaks even. The company has been living beyond its means while the CEO has been living off company funds." She spread out cash flow statements that told a damning story. Without my regular cash infusions covering shortfalls, without the money that should have stayed in corporate accounts instead of flowing to Madeline's shell company, Weston Properties was essentially a house of cards held together by other people's money. "The real question," Harper continued, "is whether the board wants to address these issues now, while they can still control the narrative, or wait for the SEC investigation to make the decisions for them." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. I could see each board member calculating the risks their personal liability, their professional reputations, their obligations to other shareholders and employees. Phillips removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes wearily. "How do we know this won't happen again? How do we know the next CEO won't make similar mistakes?" "Because," Harper said, sliding one final document across the table, "Ms. Weston is prepared to return as a major shareholder and take an active role in company oversight. Her $27 million sale yesterday was strategic, not permanent. She's willing to reinvest, but only under new leadership with proper financial controls." I felt all eyes turn to me, and for a moment, the old anxiety fluttered in my chest. These men were looking at me to be something I'd never been the one in charge, the one making decisions that would affect hundreds of employees and millions in revenue. But then I thought about Madeline's laughter echoing through that hotel ballroom, about Trent's silence when I needed him most, about all the years I'd made myself smaller to accommodate other people's ambitions. I want proper board oversight, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. Monthly financial reviews, external auditing, and transparent reporting on all consulting contracts. I want a company culture that values integrity over growth at any cost. Morrison nodded slowly. And if Trent refuses to resign? Harper's smile was arctic. Then we file complaints with the SEC tomorrow morning, and this becomes a federal investigation instead of a family matter. The choice is his. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the air conditioning cycling, the distant hum of traffic from the street below, the tick of Dad's old clock marking time like a countdown to judgment. Trent looked around the table one more time, searching for any sign of support, any ally who might stand with him against the weight of evidence. But these were businessmen first, and they could read the writing on the wall as clearly as anyone. "Whoa, what about Madeline?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. What about her?" Harper replied coldly. She received payments for services that appear to have been personal rather than professional. Whether she returns the money voluntarily or through legal action is her choice. I watched something fundamental shift in my brother's posture. The confident CEO who'd commanded this room for 5 years was disappearing, replaced by someone who looked lost and suddenly much older than his 42 years. "Clara," he said, turning to me with an expression I hadn't seen since we were children. "I never meant for things to go this far. The party. The way Madeline treated you, I should have stopped it." "Yes," I said simply. "You should have." He picked up the pen Harper had placed beside the resignation letter, his hand trembling slightly. "If I sign this, can you forgive me?" The question hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure could hold our weight. I thought about all the hurt, all the years of being dismissed and overlooked, all the times I'd swallowed my pride to keep the peace. "I can forgive you," I said finally, "but I can't trust you. Not anymore." The pen scratched across the paper with a sound like breaking glass. Trent's signature looked smaller than usual, less confident, as if even his handwriting knew this was an ending. Morrison took the signed document and passed it around the table for witness signatures. Each board member's name was added with the solemnity of people who understood they were changing the course of a family legacy. "This meeting is concluded," Morrison announced. "The board will convene tomorrow to discuss interim leadership and the implementation of new oversight protocols." As the board members filed out, talking in hushed tones about damage control and press statements, Trent remained seated at the head of the table, staring at his hands like he was seeing them for the first time. "Trent," I said softly. He looked up, and for a moment, I saw the brother who used to share secrets with me in our childhood treehouse, who cried when Mom died, who once told me I was the strongest person he knew. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time, it sounded like he meant it. I nodded, gathered my things, and walked toward the door with Harper at my side. As we reached the threshold, I heard him call my name one more time. "Clara, what happens now?" I turned back to look at him, sitting alone at the table where our father had built an empire and our mother had dreamed of leaving something lasting for both of us. "Now," I said, "we see if the company Dad built is strong enough to survive the truth." The door closed behind us with a soft click, sealing away the past and opening toward whatever came next. The sound of Trent's pen signing his resignation echoed in my mind, like the final note of a symphony I'd been composing for 38 years. Harper and I walked through the executive corridor in silence, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that had been installed when Dad first moved the company to this building. The walls were lined with photographs chronicling Weston Properties' history, groundbreaking ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, handshake deals that had shaped the Dallas skyline. In most of them, Dad stood proudly beside buildings that would outlast him. In a few of the older ones, Mom was there too, back when women were rarely seen in corporate leadership photos. There wasn't a single picture of me. "How do you feel?" Harper asked as we waited for the elevator. The question caught me off guard. How did I feel for days? I'd been operating on pure adrenaline and righteous anger, moving from one strategic decision to the next without pausing to examine the emotional wreckage left in my wake. "Empty," I said finally, and was surprised by my own honesty. I thought it would feel more like justice. Instead, it just feels finished. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and we stepped inside. Through the glass walls, I watched the floors of my family's empire slide past the accounting department where I'd once done bookkeeping during college summers, the conference rooms where I'd sat silently through meetings where my opinions weren't sought, the executive floor where decisions were made without my input about a company I'd helped fund. "Victory often feels hollow at first," Harper said gently. "You've spent decades defining yourself in relation to your family's expectations. Now, you get to figure out who you are when you're not trying to please anyone else." The lobby was bustling with the usual afternoon energy employees hurrying between meetings, clients waiting in the reception area with architectural plans spread across their laps, the hum of commerce that had funded my comfortable but constrained life. Several people nodded at me as we passed, their expressions curious but polite. Word would spread quickly about what had happened upstairs. In a company this size, secrets didn't stay secret for long. Outside, Dallas stretched before us in all directions, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows between the glass towers. The heat hit us immediately, that distinctive Texas heat that felt like walking into an oven, but somehow comforting in its familiarity. "What happens next?" I asked as we reached Harper's car. "Next, you go home and let this settle," she said, unlocking the doors. "The board will handle the immediate fallout press releases, employee communications, damage control with major clients. Trent will clean out his office and hopefully convince Madeline to return the money voluntarily. You'll get updates on everything, but for now, you're just a concerned shareholder who wants what's best for the company." I looked back at the building that housed everything my parents had worked to create. 43 floors of glass and steel, reaching toward a sky that suddenly seemed limitless instead of overwhelming. "I keep thinking about what Dad would say," I admitted. "He loved Trent so much, saw himself in him. I was always just there." Harper studied my face with the keen attention of someone who'd spent years helping women separate their worth from other people's perceptions. "Your father saw Trent as his legacy, but maybe that was never the compliment you thought it was. Maybe being different from your father was actually the point." The drive back to my apartment passed in a blur of familiar streets that looked somehow different now, like I was seeing them through new eyes. When Harper dropped me off, she handed me her business card even though I already had her contact information. "In case you need reminding," she said with a slight smile, "you're not the same woman who walked into my office yesterday. Don't let anyone convince you to go back to being her." My apartment welcomed me with its usual quiet comfort, but even here, things felt changed. The photographs on my wall told a different story now, not the nostalgic record of a family that had drifted apart, but evidence of my own journey from invisible daughter to woman with the power to reshape a corporate dynasty. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at my window, looking out at the city sprawling toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, Trent was probably packing up his office, removing the personal touches that had marked his territory for 5 years. Somewhere, Madeline was answering phone calls from lawyers and calculating whether fighting the restitution demands was worth the legal fees. My phone had been buzzing steadily since I left the office, but the calls were different now. Instead of desperate attempts from Trent to control the narrative, these were from board members confirming tomorrow's meetings, from company attorneys requesting documentation, from Harper's office with updates on Meridian Consulting's response to the demand letters. For the first time in my adult life, I was part of the conversation instead of waiting to hear about it afterward. At 6:45, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I looked through the peephole, I saw a delivery driver holding a massive bouquet of white roses. The card was simple. "Thank you for your courage. The board." I set the flowers on my kitchen counter and stared at them for a long moment. They were beautiful, elegant, the kind of gesture that acknowledged something significant had happened. but they also felt like a closing ceremony, marking the end of one chapter before the next could begin. The silence in my apartment was different now, too. Not the lonely silence of someone waiting for other people to include her, but the peaceful silence of someone who'd finally stopped waiting for permission to matter. I thought about calling someone Aunt Linda, maybe, or one of the few friends who'd stuck around despite my tendency to cancel plans whenever Trent needed something. But I realized I didn't want to explain what had happened, didn't want to justify my choices or defend my decisions. For once, I was content to sit with my own thoughts, to let the magnitude of the day settle into my bones like sediment in still water. At 9:15, my phone rang one last time. Trent's name appeared on the screen, and after a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Clara." His voice sounded hollow, defeated. I cleaned out my office, left my keys with security. "Okay." Madeline's lawyer called. "She's going to return the money. All of it." "Good." The silence stretched between us, filled with 38 years of shared history and the wreckage of what we'd once been to each other. "I don't know how to do this," he said finally. "I don't know how to be anything other than the CEO of Dad's company." For a moment, I almost slipped back into my old role, the sister who fixed things, who offered comfort, who made sacrifices to help family members through difficult transitions. But Harper's words echoed in my mind. "Don't let anyone convince you to go back to being her." "You'll figure it out," I said simply. "You're smart, you're capable, and you'll have plenty of money to take some time and decide what comes next." "Well, will you when you take over the company? Will there be a place for me?" The question hung in the air like a test I wasn't sure how to answer. Part of me wanted to offer reassurance, to promise that families could heal and trust could be rebuilt. But a larger part of me knew that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be reconstructed. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Ask me in a year." After I hung up, I sat in my living room as darkness settled over the city, thinking about time and trust and the price of forgiveness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges running a company, managing a board, proving that my vision for Weston Properties was more than just reaction to Trent's failures. But tonight, I was simply Clara Weston, a woman who'd finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in her own life. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that felt like enough. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my new penthouse in Houston, watching the sun set over a city that had become my canvas for rebuilding everything I thought I knew about power and family. The apartment was nothing like my old place in Dallas floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the entire Houston skyline, modern furniture that I'd chosen because I loved it rather than because it was practical, art on the walls that spoke to me instead of filling empty space. Everything here was deliberate, chosen, mine. My phone sat on the kitchen counter, silent for the first time in months. The transformation of Weston Properties had been exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. New leadership structures, transparent financial reporting, a company culture that valued integrity over quick profits. We'd lost some clients who preferred the old way of doing business, but we'd gained others who appreciated working with an organization that kept its promises. The board had unanimously voted me in as CEO 3 months ago, and I'd accepted on the condition that we implement every reform I'd outlined during those tense meetings. No more shadow consulting contracts, no more family members using company funds as personal piggy banks, no more decisions made in back rooms by people who confused loyalty with enabling. Trent had moved to Austin and started a small construction company with his own money. We spoke occasionally stilted conversations about industry trends and weather, carefully avoiding anything that might require real vulnerability. Madeline had disappeared entirely after returning the money. Her social media accounts scrubbed clean, her presence in Dallas erased as thoroughly as if she'd never existed. I walked back inside and poured myself a glass of wine, the same vintage I'd been drinking that night 6 months ago when everything changed. The taste brought back memories of that moment when I'd finally stopped waiting for permission to matter, when I'd realized that the power I needed had been mine all along. The financial documents spread across my dining table told a story of steady growth, not the explosive, unsustainable expansion that Trent had favored, but solid, ethical progress that could weather storms and support the people who depended on us. We were building something that would last, something Mom and Dad would have recognized as worthy of the family name. At 8:30, my phone finally broke its silence. Harper's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with the easy familiarity of someone talking to a friend rather than just a lawyer. "How are you settling in?" she asked. "Still getting used to the view," I said, looking out at the lights beginning to twinkle across Houston. "It's strange, having this much space, this much quiet. Good quiet or lonely quiet?" I considered the question as I moved through my apartment, past furniture I'd chosen and art I'd commissioned and photographs that told the story of who I was becoming rather than who I'd been. Good quiet, the kind where you can hear yourself think. "Any regrets?" It was the question everyone asked, usually with the underlying assumption that destroying your family's power structure must come with overwhelming guilt. But as I stood in my new life, looking out at a city full of possibilities I was only beginning to explore, I felt nothing but peace. "None," I said, and meant it completely. After Harper hung up, I walked back to the balcony and let the Houston evening wrap around me like a promise. The heat was different here, still Texas, still overwhelming, but somehow more honest than Dallas heat. Everything about this city felt more direct, more willing to show you exactly what it was without pretense or apology. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert Matthews, my financial advisor. "Final numbers are in. Your reinvestment in the company has generated a 32% return in 6 months. Your father would be proud." I smiled, thinking about Dad and what he would make of everything that had happened. He'd loved Trent's boldness, his willingness to take risks and chase big dreams. But I thought he might appreciate what I was building too. Something sustainable, something that treated people with dignity, something that could survive scrutiny because it had nothing to hide. As darkness settled over the city, I noticed my phone lighting up again. But these weren't desperate calls from family members trying to control damage or manipulate outcomes. These were work calls, partnership opportunities, board updates from a company that was thriving under transparent leadership. 56 calls in 90 minutes had become dozens of calls every week from people who wanted to work with the new Weston Properties, who saw value in doing business with an organization that meant what it said. I scrolled through the missed calls and text messages, each one representing a choice I now had the power to make: which projects to pursue, which partnerships to accept, which direction to take the company my parents had built. For the first time in my life, I wasn't asking permission or waiting for approval. I was simply deciding. The city stretched out below me like a map of everything I hadn't yet explored. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to prove that the woman who'd been thrown out of her own family's party could build something better than what she'd left behind. But tonight, I was content to stand in my new space, surrounded by silence that felt like victory instead of exile, watching the lights of Houston flicker to life like stars coming out after a storm. I'd started this journey as Clara Weston, the useless sister who contributed nothing to her family's empire. I'd ended it as Clara Weston, CEO of a company that was stronger, more ethical, and more sustainable than anything my brother had ever imagined. They'd called me useless and kicked me out, so I'd sold my $27 million stake and waited for their 56 desperate calls. And when they finally came, I'd let every single one go to voicemail. Sometimes the most powerful response is silence. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply walking away from people who never deserved your presence in the first place. And sometimes being thrown out of the wrong room is exactly how you find your way to the right one. Thank you for listening to this story of transformation and resilience. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from today? Are you in Dallas, Houston, or somewhere completely different? Please leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts on Clara's journey. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of people who refused to stay small. And let me know what resonated most with you about this tale of family, power, and finding your voice when it matters most.